So we are on chapter 9 today. Let's get started. Chapter 9, Love and Lovecraft. I wept a little then, more from the mix of discomfort and adrenaline than from any real sorrow, but I was afraid that Mr. Blackwood might not return as promised, and to leave me to rot in the cellars of Northwich Hall. He was such a disagreeable man, prideful, pompous, wicked to the marrow of his bones. There was not an ounce of charity in his wizened heart. The cephalopod, on the other hand, lingered outside the door like a beaten dog, afraid of incurring its master's wrath upon Blackwood's return. I felt horrible for it. I imagined it spent its days alone in this dark, damp basement, tucked out of sight like a prisoner in an oubliette. One tentacle had curled itself around the doorframe, as if it did not wish to be ogled or struck, yet still craved the warmth of human kindness. Eventually, I pulled myself together, and sniffling, I dried my face upon the edge of my shawl. "Shouldn't you be near the sea?" I asked the tentacle. The tip, which had been flickering like the tail of a cat, ceased to move. One great yellow eye peered around the doorway. I sat up on the bed and swallowed my sorrow, tried to steel my voice so that I wouldn't sound weak or vulnerable. "I only thought that something like yourself would be more comfortable in the wide expanse of the ocean, not trapped underground like a rat. This can't be your natural environment. No loving God would create an animal like you to live in a cave." The body slipped into the room, shy but curious. Now that I had a clear view of it, I saw that it was not quite like the kraken. One might mistake it to be an octopus of the size of a mule, but its athletic legs had the ability to be strong and stout. It was capable of holding itself up in a terrestrial environment, and it needed no water to support its weight. The skin changed hue from dappled orange to rich purple, with the nearest tentacle deepening into an indigo blue. There may have been a beak underneath that mess of constantly shifting tendrils, but I couldn't see it. "And I suppose I can infer from Blackwood's discussion with you that you are looking for whatever has stolen away Earl and George," I said, "and that you are of equal intelligence to Blackwood, and perhaps even a greater intelligence, for while he may show disgust to you, he doesn't talk down to you as one might to a pet." I toyed with the swollen bulge of my ankle. "He is a terrible person, I think, very proud." The beast poured itself over the floor to pool at my feet and wrap its tentacles around my leg, and it poked and prodded as if it wished to know the full extent of my injury. "I'll be fine. I only twisted it when I fell. I don't think it's sprained." The suction cups made little kisses along my calf. "Well, that's not very proper," I scolded it, but with a smile to soften my disapproval. "I don't even know your name." I placed my hand over the space between its eyes, examining the gash as I probed its aura for a hint of its intentions. He, I suppose, Blackwood had given it a pronoun, he leaned into my palm. He was terribly lonely. His despair was like a gulf of black ink, seeping around the edges of his emotions, polluting every impulse with depression. He'd been alone and cut off from his own kind for a very long time. "You have no way of communicating with Blackwood, do you?" I said, "and he's the only other living creature you see." The great beast flattened himself and oozed under the cot, with one tentacle curling itself around my leg and another around my wrist, a comforting gesture that I found amicable and caring. He would not abandon me to the forgotten corners of Northwich's basement. He would stay and ensure my comfort, even if he could not vocalize his intentions. "Thank you for your kindness," I said. The tentacle radiated a spark of happiness that cut through his loneliness like the light of a candle. "Well," I said, reclining on the cot, "if it's conversation you crave, then you must come and visit me every night in my garden. The invitation is formal, sir, and I will accept no excuse." The spark blossomed into an electric sensation of happy surprise. The color of his skin shifted from oranges and blues to a brilliant, joyful yellow, and the sudden change made me laugh in spite of the circumstances. When Blackwood returned, holding up a lantern in one hand and a strip of cotton cloth with the other, I'd been dozing in comfort and wondering at the nature of his strange relationship with the cephalopod under my bed. But Blackwood answered none of my questions. He waited in silence as I wrapped my ankle tightly, his mouth clamped closed. When I was done, he held out his arm and helped me to my feet and said, "I've hired you a horse. I expect your father to reimburse the expense." I turned to the amber eyes peeking from under the cot. "Thank you for your help," I said. One tentacle slipped out, and a sucker kissed the back of my hand. Blackwood gave a disgusted groan at this show of gentlemanly behavior. With difficulty, I hobbled up the circular stone stairs to the main floor of the mansion, then through the maze of halls and rooms to the front entrance. The horse was a dappled nag, all knobby knees and scruffy hide. I'd been thoroughly turned about in the lightless cellars, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not night, as I assumed. Instead, the mists of morning had transformed it into a clement afternoon, and the late-hour sun painted the yard in yellow and gold. I'd been in the basement of Northwich Hall for most of the day. I climbed astride the old horse, as graceful as a sack of oats, and Blackwood gave a slap across its rump to send it away, with no word of goodbye to me. The horse plodded across the pastures towards home, tearing mouthfuls of grass. My mother was all aflutter with concern, my sisters full of questions, and Jane the worst of them. She'd worked herself into a dreadful anxiety, and when she saw me, she threw her arms around me and pressed a kiss to my cheek and said, "I'm certain you were dead." "Oh, Jane, did I not assure you? Our Harry is the resourceful one," said Papa over his newspaper, sitting by the fire, "only a bit turned about in the fog. How lucky for you to have stumbled across Mr. Blackwood." "He is your saviour, my duckling," said Mamma. "We must send him a gift. What would he like? I shall make him a cake. Do you think that will be sufficient?" My father shook his papers straight and folded them closed. "That depends on the quality of your cake, my dear," he said. "But I suggest you ask Beatrice to do the baking, if we do not want to turn the gentleman against us." Then to me he said, "Glad you're back, Harry. I shall return the horse to town and inform the darlings that you're unharmed." "And Mr. Blackwood has asked for the recompense of the horse," I said, gesturing out the window, where I'd left the nag tied at the fence post. It seemed happy to stand with its head slung low, eating the lawn. Jane helped me upstairs, fussing like an old woman, to tuck me into bed with my foot raised on a pillow, and a cup of piping hot tea procured, and a scone with a pat of butter to munch upon. When I was perfectly comfortable, she sat at my bedside and said, "Tell me everything that happened to you." So I did, omitting no detail, and when I was done I bid her to do the same. "Mary ran headlong to the Darling cottage," she said in a rush, "and we flew outside to find the whole heath alive with the screams and howls of the fight, and we were so terrified, Harry, that we could barely think of anything except to flee, and Mary feels the worst of us, and is very sorry, for she blames herself for abandoning you fully, but none of us were brave enough to come and find you." Jane took a restorative breath. "We ran immediately to town to fetch the regiment, but by the time we returned with as many soldiers as they could spare, which was very few, I must say, and was quite a disappointment, there was nothing to be discovered except ruts in the torn earth, in all directions. You, and the Titans between which you had inserted yourself, you foolish goose, had vanished completely." She clenched my hands tightly, which caused a spray of crumbs to erupt from the scone. "And we suspected you'd been carried off and eaten up. And when we told the captain, he said we'd seen nothing more than shapes in the fog, and had we not caused enough trouble with our silly little snake stories." Her face flushed red with frustration. "The captain said there was an upstanding young man in need of finding, and the regiment had no time for wayward ladies chasing after lizards, and we insisted that you were in grave danger, but no one believed us." Emma and Mary appeared at the door. "A few of the soldiers took pity on us in our distress, but what could they do?" said my youngest sister. "They had orders to follow, and their numbers were already stretched thin searching for George, and their nerves frayed with the strange circumstances of Earl's demise." "I should not have left you," Mary said meekly. "I'm a terrible sister." "All is forgiven," I said firmly. "Let me at least tend to your ankle," Emma said, and she seated herself at my feet. I consented to let her unwrap the bandage, and Emma ran her fingers over the swollen joint. A pleasant warmth radiated out from her touch, and the pain eased just a fraction. "Has George been found?" I said. "No," said Mary, "not a single hint of where he's gone." "But a third is missing now, too," said Emma. "This afternoon, when the search parties returned from looking for George, Teddy Crumpsall was not among them." "Teddy?" I said. Mary nodded. "No one saw him disappear. One second he was with the company, and then he was not." As her hands continued to massage my injury, Emma said, "Papa has told us we're not to worry. It will all turn out as it should in the end. You know how he can be, so frightfully philosophical. But Mamma is in absolute fits at the thought of Dunham's most eligible bachelors disappearing one by one." Mary crossed her arms and scowled. "At this rate, we'll be forced into spinsterhood for lack of options." She glanced at me. "No offense, Harry, but it's not my intention to grow old in Lovecraft Cottage, tending to Mamma and Papa in their golden years." Nor had it been my intention. However, I'd long since reconciled myself to my fate, and I waved her comment away. But Emma seemed particularly horrified by this revelation. "Oh, sweet mercy, we must find George and Teddy." "But where should the soldiers look for them?" Jane prompted. Earl was only discovered because part of his foot stuck from the solid wood of the bridge. What if George and Teddy are fully encased in a rock wall or a giant witch elm? They might never be found. I leaned back in my pillows. Mr. Blackwood made a curious comment. He stated that something is hungry, I told them, and I am quite sure he meant the second creature on the heath. I suppressed a shudder at the memory of those fiery eyes, the frayed and desiccated body, the mossy rot of its ragged clothes, the gleaming crystalline teeth. I cannot hope to understand what I'd witnessed on Dreadmoor, but if that monstrosity is abducting the young men with no intention of consuming them... I cannot hope to understand what I witnessed on Dreadmoor, but if that monstrosity is abducting the young men with the intention of consuming them, there may be very little left for us to find. We four sat a moment in quiet contemplation. How can any of this be possible? Mary wondered, more to herself than to us. I crossed my arms. The rules of nature have abandoned Dunham County of late, I said. Between the outlandish creatures on the heath and the impossible manner of Earl's death, I don't know how much we can rely on common sense. The answer to our problem lies far outside the boundaries of our rational thinking. We do not even know the words to ask the question, and thus we can't even start to understand the answer. And that's the dickens of it, Emma replied. Captain Crankshaw clings to rational thought. Mary tried in vain to describe what she saw, yet he insists there's no such thing as ghouls, and this is nothing more than the work of a rabid wolf. Oh, damned arrogance, I said, causing them all to startle, that the man could think Mary to be mistaken. That gruesome demon looked nothing like a wolf. No matter what evidence is presented, he refuses to see anything more than a sick animal, she continued, looking very much like she could burst into tears at any moment. He would not listen to our side of the tale, and said we're all hysterical, and imagining things that aren't there. Jane reached out and grasped my wrist. Her fear and frustration sizzled across my skin and skittered up through my veins. I gritted at teeth. We're at war, without the assistance of our friends, and we do not even know the identity or motive of our enemy, I replied. What do we do? Emma said. Well, we can't just sit here, can we? I snarled as I struggled to sit. You're in no position to go anywhere, Jane scolded. Emma's done her best, but at least give your ankle a few hours' rest. The swelling has already gone down a little, I began, but Jane would have none of my bravado. Instead, she brought me a book from Papa's library to read, a great tome on the heroes and gods of old, and told me to remain in bed with my foot raised. She and Emma and Mary would scout the valley and return with information. They would take Mr. Marsh of the regiment with them for security. I was to stay firmly put. I read about the kraken, the leviathan, the behemoth. I searched for a hint of the antlered creature, but found nothing to match its appearance. There were stories of the men of Celtica, who wore stags' heads to terrify their opponents, but that didn't match what I'd seen on the foggy heath. No, it had been all rags and bones and skeletal limbs, with fingers like claws and jaws like an anglerfish. I read about the yellow emperor of ancient Carcosa, who kept a kennel of dog beasts in the yard of his castle, great leprous things with matted fur and fangs sheathed in bronze, trained to devour the heads of trespassers. And I read about the ferocious Amarok, who prowled the barren ice fields of the high Arctic, feasting on the souls of greedy hunters. I read about the Wahila of Upper America, and the dog pigs of Namibia, and the Gabhali of the humid Liberian jungles, more alligator than canine. I read all of these things, yet none of them seemed to fit the beast with which I had been confronted. At last, exhausted, I put the book aside. Why would such a creature prey upon the good people of Dunham? What had we done to suffer such an infestation? It had started with the Posies, I was certain, and the nucleus of the problem was Northwich Hall. What foul curse had Mr. Blackwood awoken? I curled upon my bed and soon found myself asleep, dreaming of bloodthirsty stags and emotionless alabaster faces holding haunted, molten eyes. I woke that night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, and I limped from my room to the kitchen. I'd slept early and fitfully, and that had left me wide awake at the midnight hour. After replacing the book in Papa's library, I found myself drifting to the garden, although I was not so eager to go as far as the huntsman's oak and sit in its branches. There was a small bench by the back door, and I sat there, looking out over our little frog pond. The moon reflected in its waters like a disk of silver dancing on a plate of jet. Past the pond lay the hedge and the stone wall, beyond which stretched fields of green wheat all the way to Dunham village, which from this great distance looked like a tiny cluster of hunched jurors deliberating together in the distant wrinkle of the river valley. Despair began to creep into my thoughts. poor little Dunham. What terrible beast was stalking the paths around its edges, stealing its citizens one by one? What had all three victims had in common? I could not figure a common thread. They were of different ages and occupations, taken at different times. What had linked them together and sealed their fates? All of them male, that's a start, and all of them in the county of Dunham, and all of them, well, was there another trait? Earl Rabbit and George Darling and Teddy Crumpsall. Earl had been the son of the baker, George an accountant in training, and Teddy the son of the butcher. All three of them accomplished in their own ways, none of them poor or destitute. They were young men who had great prospects laid before them, and all in the most robust of health, and vigorous with the competition of bachelorhood. Could that be the key? I slowly grew aware of eyes upon me. I smiled and looked up with the intention of greeting my monster, to whom I had given a formal invitation, and for whom stealth was second nature. "Are you there?" I said. "Come and sit with me. There's no need to be shy." The surface of the frog pond shivered. Two amber eyes popped up from the center, looking back and forth to make sure the yard was empty. "I'm alone," I said. "They're all asleep." Water sloshed, waves lapped at the stone edge, and the kraken hauled himself from the black water and dragged himself to the bench, where he curled around the flower pots. One cool, wet tentacle wound itself around my hand, and I was suddenly flooded with the sensations of gratitude and friendliness. "Well, I'm happy to see you too," I assured him. "How long have you been in the frog pond?" There came an assurance that all waiting was worthwhile. When one lives alone in a dark cellar with no distractions or entertainments, one becomes adept at patience. "How beastly," I whispered. "Blackwood should not keep you locked up in such a manner." But I was mistaken. "You're not a prisoner?" I said. "Assuredly not. There was no sense of liberty lost, only of careful consideration." "Oh," I said, as I sorted through the web of feelings, "you're able to come and go as you wish, but you dare not to be seen, and that restricts you." Affirmation. The tentacle slithered a little higher up my arm, and a second embraced my bare leg, leaving little kisses behind my knee. Through this secondary tendril I felt elation and wonder at my willingness to accept his eldritch appearance. I smiled kindly. "I don't have many friends," I replied. "Like you, I tend to avoid human contact. Forgive me, I wouldn't presume to place my own loneliness in competition with yours, but I've lived a life apart from others because this sensitivity of mine makes relationships very difficult. I'm happy to make your acquaintance, sir, because you're the first creature I've met who is honest with his feelings, and does not try to hide sadness or forlornness or frustration behind a mask of insincere levity or a litany of empty words." A pop of surprise, a warmth of shared understanding, followed quickly by a sense of common purpose. "Yes, I suppose we are very much alike," I replied, "though I'm not nearly as pretty as you, what with your various colors. Goodness, some of them are so exotic I don't think they even have a name." I ran my hand over one tentacle, and from the touch of my fingers spread a flush of green blues and apricots, speckled like leopard spots. "How will I ever describe you to my sisters?" He gave a surge of bashfulness at being described as pretty. "Well, you've been alone too long, with no one to pay you compliments," I said. That must not be left to stand. I think you've shown yourself to be brave and honorable, and those are very attractive traits, and do much to redeem any faults." 4 or 5 tentacles wobbled in the air. "No, I hardly think those are faults at all," I assured him. "I'm sure you can do all sorts of marvelous feats." He wrapped one into a clever knot, and a burst of humor sparkled across his skin and made me laugh. For a few minutes, we sat in mutual comfort, trading emotions back and forth in a silent conversation. He was of such a good character, full of optimism and openness, that I found my own nature rising to meet him, and all of the dark futility I'd previously harbored at our village's present situation seemed to drip away. His positivity was infectious. We would find the antlered demon, he was sure of it. I bent close to him and stroked my palm across his multitude of pale suckers. "How can you be so sure?" One tentacle caressed the side of my neck. Through its light touch I felt an ironclad determination. This was his quest. He would not rest until he'd found the devil and destroyed it. Unbidden, I felt dread for him. Under any other circumstance I would have kept my foolish heart to myself, fearful that my concerns would have been misconstrued as meddlesome if I exposed my opinions so baldly. If our conversation had been comprised of words alone, I would have pushed down my concerns and hid my doubts, for we'd only just met, and who am I to put such weight on a new acquaintance? But the tactile nature of our conversation gave no ability to lie, and there was no hiding how I felt. Before I could temper my concerns, he knew that I was worried for him. Be careful, I said regardless. I want more time to get to know you. I'd be so terribly disappointed if you were lost, because I've only just found you. Such a flood of affection crossed his skin, I blushed to feel it. He'd been lonely for so long, and in the company of such a churlish gentleman, he hardly knew what to do with my declaration. One sucker set itself upon my cheek, and provided me with a kiss of remarkable passion and zeal. Well, it's been a very long time since I've enjoyed such attention, I replied, somewhat breathless at the tingle which his kiss had left upon my face, and I curled against him, caring not at all for the dampness of the ground or the beads of pond water that had collected between his tentacles. We sat together in joyful silence until the moon fell below the western horizon, and our wordless conversation was so full of warmth and devotion it chased away the chill of the spring night. At long last, a hint of light in the east meant we needed to say farewell, and as I watched him go, I found myself already eager to see him again. That's the end of chapter 9. I'll see you tomorrow for chapter 10. Wash your hands, get lots of sleep, stay well. See you then. Bye.